This report does not seek to fascinate, it seeks to understand. Understanding is not excusing, it is refusing to let it happen again in the shadows.
In the quiet farming community of Plainfield, a local handyman was widely known for his highly reliable work and remarkably gentle, unassuming, and helpful demeanor. Neighbors implicitly trusted him to fix their dilapidated roofs, patch their wooden fences, and even babysit their young children while they ran errands in town. He was a reassuring fixture of rural life, blending perfectly into the background of a peaceful society. Then, the local hardware store owner vanished without a trace. The ensuing criminal investigation breached the threshold of his isolated farmhouse, uncovering a reality far darker than anyone in the tight-knit community could have possibly imagined. This shocking discovery forces us to ask, what does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator, and how does society fail to see it? To examine this historic case objectively, we must establish clear boundaries. Throughout this analysis, we will refer to our subject as the skin tailor. Between the years of 1954 and 1957, the subject operated in absolute secrecy, taking advantage of the vast, isolated rural landscapes surrounding his home. He frequently utilized the loose, sandy soil of local cemeteries to meticulously unearth freshly buried coffins entirely under the silent cover of midnight darkness. The profile methodically removed artifacts from these sites, bringing the remains back to an unlit, dilapidated farmhouse that stood completely isolated from the main community roads. Eventually, his illicit nocturnal activities escalated from systematic thefts to active homicide, ultimately resulting in the confirmed deaths of 2 women from the surrounding local area. When law enforcement finally breached the subject's barricaded property, they discovered an overwhelming and meticulously organized collection of carefully preserved anatomical items scattered throughout the residence. These unimaginable discoveries permanently shattered the comforting illusion of domestic safety, leaving seasoned investigators and the public struggling to comprehend the true extent of his crimes. To the outside world, the profile presented a masterclass in unassuming camouflage. He was the quiet, reliable neighbor, a simple handyman woven seamlessly into the rural fabric. He fixed broken roofs, painted fences, and mended steps. The community viewed him not as a threat, but as a harmless, dependable fixture of their everyday existence. This perceived simplicity was his greatest psychological shield. By projecting an aura of mild-mannered subservience, he effectively disarmed the natural defenses of everyone he encountered daily. Parents trusted him implicitly to watch their children. He was often preferred over other adults because his social awkwardness made him appear gentle, naive, and entirely unthreatening. His extreme shyness and tendency to laugh quietly at unseen jokes were dismissed as mere eccentricities, completely ignoring the profound schizoid isolation festering just beneath the surface. How does a predator operate in plain sight? He manipulates perception. By embracing the role of the town fool, the subject effectively rendered himself completely invisible. When he made bizarre, unsettling remarks to local residents, they laughed it off as strange humor. His total lack of outward aggression provided the perfect psychological alibi. He weaponized their trust. The tight-knit community's inherent belief in domestic safety blinded them to the severe psychological regression taking hold inside his isolated, decaying farmhouse. His camouflage was flawless precisely because it was deeply pathetic. No one looks for a highly organized predator inside the shell of a lonely, grieving, broken man. The mask of the helpful neighbor allowed him to quietly scout the town, tracking routines and gathering intelligence while hidden behind a veil of utter mediocrity. This deception relied heavily on the societal tendency to pity the socially inept. Sympathy became the perfect cloaking device for his rapidly escalating mental deterioration and compulsions. He operated in a perfectly insulated echo chamber of his own design. The isolation of his rural property provided the absolute secrecy necessary to nurture his darkness. He appeared utterly devoted to his late mother, earning sympathy from locals who viewed him as a tragic, dutiful son rather than a dangerously fractured, unstable individual. They saw a man frozen in grief, completely missing the pathological nature of his attachment. This grief was not a healing wound, but an active, consuming infection. His mundane daily routines were nothing more than a carefully rehearsed performance. Every interaction at the local store was a calculated exertion of his fabricated public persona. But this carefully constructed social facade was entirely brittle. Behind the locked doors of his desolate home, a profound and horrifying transformation was slowly taking complete control. As the comforting illusion of his harmlessness persisted in town, the severe psychological pressure within his mind finally reached a breaking point, demanding a terrible physical manifestation. Yet, even the most perfect mask eventually slips. The quiet handyman was steadily building a private universe where the strict boundaries between the living and dead vanished. The community slept soundly, convinced that predators only existed in dark alleys of distant cities, completely unaware that a severe psychological storm was brewing in their fields. The tension was mounting rapidly. The subject had successfully deceived them all, but his escalating urges would soon require him to cross a devastating, irreversible physical threshold. The profile operated with absolute impunity for years, completely shielded by his carefully constructed facade. But every predator eventually makes a fatal, irreversible tactical error. His escalating psychological compulsions demanded a new victim. He targeted a local hardware store, returning to a location where he was already a familiar, unassuming presence. This was his first devastating mistake. He abandoned his previous method of isolated, midnight excursions, opting instead to strike during the early, vulnerable daylight hours. He entered the quiet shop while the surrounding town was distracted by a local hunting season, believing this temporary emptiness provided him sufficient operational cover. The ensuing crime was swift, but it was incredibly messy. His deteriorating mental state completely overshadowed the cold, calculating discipline he had always previously maintained. He left obvious physical evidence behind, including a highly visible trail across the floorboards. Most damningly, he requested a written sales receipt for a minor chemical purchase. This single piece of paper, documenting a mundane transaction, became the vital physical anchor that permanently and completely shattered his elaborate illusion of harmless rural mediocrity. When the proprietor's son, who served as a local deputy, discovered the empty store, he immediately recognized the severe anomaly of the open cash register. The deputy reviewed the final transaction record. Seeing the subject's name meticulously written on the receipt instantly connected the quiet handyman to the horrific disappearance. Law enforcement mobilized rapidly, abandoning their prior perception of him as a gentle eccentric. The psychological camouflage had failed, exposing the dangerous predator hiding underneath. Investigators quickly located the subject dining quietly at a neighbor's house, perfectly acting out his mundane daily routine as if the morning's violence had never occurred. He was immediately detained. Meanwhile, a tactical team approached his desolate, decaying farmhouse, preparing to breach the heavily fortified perimeter of his isolated, dark domain. Because the property possessed absolutely no electricity, the officers were forced to navigate the pitch-black interior utilizing only the narrow, piercing beams of their flashlights. The beams cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the overwhelming, claustrophobic horde of debris that choked the narrow hallways of the rapidly deteriorating rural structure. As investigators penetrated deeper into the residence, the true scale of his severe psychosis was finally revealed. The physical evidence of his compulsions surrounded them completely. Decades of carefully hidden secrets were instantly exposed to the harsh, unforgiving light of institutional scrutiny. The farmhouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a tomb. Under intense interrogation, the subject initially attempted to deploy his usual defense mechanism of severe memory loss and mild-mannered confusion, feigning total innocence and ignorance. But the sheer volume of undeniable forensic evidence recovered from his property crushed his resistance. The psychological pressure of confinement finally broke his fractured mind. He eventually confessed to the disappearances, admitting that his overwhelming delusions had entirely driven his nocturnal activities and his horrific, systematic collection of human artifacts. The community was paralyzed by the devastating revelation. The arrest effectively neutralized the predator. But this initial apprehension is only the beginning of what comes next. He fundamentally proved that the most dangerous threats do not arrive as obvious monsters. They are often the quiet, helpful neighbors blending perfectly into our mundane routines. We have dissected his deeply fractured origins, his meticulous operational methods, and the unstoppable, terrifying psychological impulses that ultimately led to his complete and total systemic collapse. With his psychological profile completely deconstructed and his clinical motivations laid bare, we finally possess all the necessary elements to definitively classify this unprecedented, historical criminal profile. The evidence is compiled. The psychological boundaries are drawn. It is time to step back and reveal the true structural archetype that completely defines the man behind the mask. To understand the profile, we must dissect a deeply toxic origin. He was raised in absolute rural isolation, trapped within a severely fractured and highly abusive domestic environment. His father was a chronic alcoholic, offering nothing but physical brutality and psychological absence. This instilled a profound, early sense of fear and warped masculine identity. The true architect of his psychosis, however, was his mother. She was a domineering religious fanatic who wielded total authoritarian control over every aspect of his existence. She subjected him to daily readings of divine retribution and apocalyptic floods. She relentlessly preached that the outside world was inherently wicked, corrupt, and deeply dangerous. Most destructively, she conditioned him to believe that all women were instruments of sin. This systematic indoctrination bred a deep, terrifying confusion regarding basic human intimacy. Ridiculed by classmates for his extreme shyness and beaten by his father at home, he quickly learned that the outside world was entirely hostile and unforgiving. His mother weaponized this rejection, further insulating him from society. She convinced him that only her love was pure, cementing a classic, severely unresolved psychological attachment. Any emerging adolescent sexuality was violently repressed. When caught exploring his own body, he was severely traumatized, taught that physical desires were a vile, unforgivable curse. This extreme psychological castration forged a devastating pathological dependency. He both worshipped and unconsciously resented the woman who had completely consumed his developing personal identity. The fragile domestic ecosystem finally shattered when his father passed away, followed closely by the highly suspicious death of his older brother during a marshland fire. He was left entirely alone to nurse his ailing mother after a paralyzing stroke. When she eventually died, his last remaining tether to objective reality snapped completely. Her passing did not bring liberation. It triggered an absolute psychological collapse. He lost his supreme ruler, his only friend, and his entire reason for existing. In a profound display of psychotic preservation, he boarded up her living quarters, sealing her rooms like an undisturbed, dusty tomb while he decayed nearby. Retreating into a single, squalid room, he severed all remaining meaningful ties with society. The isolated farmhouse became a silent incubator for his rapidly deteriorating mind. Crushing loneliness gave way to intense schizophrenic delusions. He began obsessively consuming esoteric medical texts, true crime literature, and dark materials regarding anatomy and physical preservation. In the oppressive silence of the empty farm, auditory hallucinations took hold. The subject began hearing commanding voices, urging him to undo the permanence of death. He developed an overwhelming pathological compulsion to physically recreate the maternal figure he had lost. The boundary between grief and absolute madness had been irrevocably breached. He initially believed he could resurrect the dead through sheer willpower. When reality failed to align with his delusions, he sought a far more grotesque solution. This was the ultimate fracture, the deeply ingrained religious guilt, the severe isolation, and the pathological grief finally synthesized into a terrifying singular, an unstoppable drive. The obedient, quiet handyman was gone, replaced entirely by a predator driven by unimaginable compulsions. Now that he was broken, what happens when he crosses the line? In behavioral profiling, we draw a strict boundary between how a predator operates and why. The modus operandi is practical, but the signature is purely psychological. To secure his targets, the subject relied on extreme geographical isolation. He navigated desolate rural landscapes under the absolute cover of midnight darkness to avoid detection. His practical methods were highly organized and patient. He utilized the region's loose, sandy soil, employing quiet hand tools to complete his extractions with absolute precision. When his nocturnal activities eventually escalated to active homicide, his tactical method remained coldly efficient. He selected highly isolated targets during quiet hours to minimize risk. He then transported the acquired materials directly to his heavily fortified, decaying property. This remote environment provided the absolute secrecy required to transition into his signature. While his modus operandi was designed simply to secure the target, his signature was driven entirely by an unrelenting, deeply rooted psychological compulsion and severe trauma. The subject needed to engage in highly methodical post-crime preservation rituals. He practiced disturbing forms of anatomical taxidermy, desperate to reverse his profound experience of loss. These actions were entirely devoid of practical utility. They were the physical manifestation of his profound mental fracture, an attempt to rebuild his shattered domestic universe. He developed an overwhelming fixation on creating somatic garments. By crafting these items, he temporarily inhabited the dominant, maternal identity that had completely consumed his childhood. This severe psychological fetishism provided a false sense of absolute control. The physical artifacts allowed him to exist in a delusional reality where boundaries completely dissolved. The modus operandi belonged to the quiet handyman blending into the background. The signature belonged to the fractured mind surrendering entirely to its most horrifying compulsions. Every preserved artifact hidden within his desolate residence served this deeply ingrained psychological delusion. They were physical trophies marking his complete detachment from objective human reality. His preservation methods were not merely chaotic impulses, but deeply clinical obsessions. He utilized complex medical texts to perfect his techniques within the isolated, dilapidated farmhouse. The property transformed from a simple domestic space into an active psychological incubator. It became a perfectly insulated echo chamber designed to nurture his escalating darkness. The compulsion to create these items provided temporary relief from his crushing isolation. However, the psychological hunger driving his signature was a bottomless void demanding sustenance. As his internal delusions grew stronger, they began to overwhelm his tactical discipline. Maintaining such a highly complex operational method requires immense, sustained psychological focus. When his compulsions finally reached their absolute peak, the careful structure of his modus operandi began to erode. The predator became dangerously careless during his attacks. His overwhelming psychological drive completely overpowered his previously flawless, calculated caution. The isolated farm was no longer an impenetrable fortress masking his terrifying, hidden nocturnal reality. His escalating needs demanded riskier excursions, steadily increasing his exposure to a tight-knit, highly observant community. The careful camouflage protecting him for years was rapidly unraveling. The predator was now operating with reckless abandon, lost entirely within his consuming delusions. But when an organized system shatters, what happens when it finally breaks? The individual hiding behind the harmless facade of a rural handyman is Edward Theodore Gein, historically recorded as the Plainfield Ghoul. Throughout this analysis, we designated him as the Skin Tailor. This alias reflects his highly methodical, post-crime compulsion to utilize human materials to craft somatic garments and anatomical artifacts, driven by a profound psychological fracture and maternal fixation. To fully understand his criminal pathology and the mechanics of his descent, we must evaluate his methods through the Pentagon of Evil framework. Operating between 1954 and 1957 in Plainfield, Wisconsin, Gein has 2 confirmed homicide victims, alongside numerous instances of nocturnal grave robbery. His profile is defined by his unassuming integration into a quiet farming community and his elaborate creation of human crafts, serving as a tragic physical manifestation of his severe schizophrenic delusions and absolute domestic isolation.
The mystery is over. The trump card is on the table. So, did you recognize him?
Premeditation, 4 out of 10. While Gein exhibited patience and tactical awareness during his nocturnal graveyard excursions, his homicidal planning was largely opportunistic and lacked sophisticated, long-term operational structure. His attacks on 2 local business owners occurred in familiar settings where he was a known entity, driven more by immediate psychological impulses than by calculated predatory hunting. His eventual mistakes, such as leaving a direct paper trail and obvious physical evidence, demonstrate a fundamentally disorganized approach to homicide. Signature, 10 out of 10. Gein's psychological compulsions completely overshadowed his practical methods. His signature involved an unprecedented, complex ritual of anatomical preservation and taxidermy. Driven by a severe Oedipal fracture following the death of his domineering mother, he engaged in the meticulous creation of somatic garments and macabre household items. This compulsion to construct a physical replacement for his lost matriarch was an absolute necessity for the profile, forming one of the most distinctive signatures in criminal history. Mobility, 2 out of 10. Gein operated within an extremely restricted geographical zone. His entire criminal career was confined to the immediate rural surroundings of Plainfield, Wisconsin. He relied heavily on his isolated, decaying family farmhouse as a secure sanctuary to conduct his post-crime rituals. His lack of travel, deep integration into the local farming community, and complete dependence on the regional environment severely limited his operational radius, making him a highly stationary, localized offender. Resistance, 4 out of 10. For several years, Gein successfully avoided detection simply by maintaining the facade of a quiet, eccentric, and harmless neighbor. However, this camouflage was not a sophisticated counterintelligence strategy. It was merely a byproduct of society's tendency to overlook the socially awkward. When he escalated to active homicide, his forensic resistance crumbled completely. He left a sales receipt linking him directly to the scene, and his unsecured farmhouse immediately surrendered overwhelming evidence upon entry. Impact, 8 out of 10. Although his confirmed victim count is relatively low, Gein's cultural and psychological footprint is monumental. The discovery of his crimes fundamentally shattered the illusion of post-war rural safety and forced law enforcement to recognize that extreme psychopathology could hide in plain sight. His devastating narrative laid the foundation for modern criminal profiling and permanently altered popular culture, directly inspiring an entire genre of psychological horror and a lasting societal fascination with the macabre. Final score, 28 out of 50. Edward Gein's evaluation reveals a highly localized, opportunistic offender driven by an overwhelming, all-consuming psychological signature. What does it take for an ordinary person to become a predator? For Gein, it required a profound, untreated mental fracture forged in isolation and severe maternal trauma, transforming grief into pathological delusion. And how does society fail to see it? Plainfield overlooked him because human nature equates harmless mediocrity with safety. Society pities the quiet outcast, failing to realize that the most extreme horrors do not always arrive as obvious threats. Sometimes, they are quietly waiting behind the polite smile of a familiar neighbor.
Some monsters are born in the shadows. Others are the shadow itself. The verdict is etched in stone, but make no mistake, evil never stops. It simply changes its face. Many more monsters await dissection on this channel. Stay vigilant. Case closed.